We shall now be moving on to the other aspect of our Crinu today, and that is a reading of the prize-winning essays. So it gives me great pleasure to now introduce one of the former winners of the Clans of Ireland essay competition, Mr. Daniel Curley. Daniel completed an MA in Medieval Studies at NUI Galway in 2011, and he has just completed a PhD which focuses on the elite archaeologies of the later medieval Õ Cellaigh lords of Uí Maine. Daniel is a manager of the Rathcroghan Visitor Centre, and he's authored a number of books and articles relating to his professional and personal academic interests. Daniel, of course, was a winner of the 2019 Chiefs and Clans Essay Competition Prize for his entry on Uilliam Buide Õ Cellaigh and the late medieval Renaissance of the Uí Maine Lordship, which was printed in the Clans of Ireland anthology and which was launched, of course, last year. So without any further ado, I now invite Daniel to talk about his winning essay.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, everyone. I'm very interested in the Linea Antiqua project in and of itself, and I certainly will be supporting it as part of my professional endeavours at Rathcroghan Visitor Centre, so I'd certainly urge everyone else to do the same. It would be a valuable addition to the public conscious. So I suppose I'm going to go through briefly what my essay involved. I was delighted to be successful in the Õ Cellaigh Lordship. So very briefly, I'm going to go through a historical background as to who the Õ Cellaigh of Uí Maine are, an indication of the political background, the military background to high medieval Eastern Connacht in advance of Uilliam Buide's career, and then a brief undertaking of the multidisciplinary approaches that I've applied to his career in order to try and better understand what a later medieval Gaelic lord be engaging in, particularly an ambitious one such as Uilliam Buide. So just in terms of dating conventions, particularly high medieval I refer to will be 1100 to 1350, late medieval 1350 to 1600. So the Õ Cellaigh of Uí Maine, a very prominent early medieval dynasty whose territory was broadly coextensive with what is now South Roscommon and East Galway. So in the early medieval period at a particular point in time, we see the Uí Maine split into three different branches with an effectively semi-independent territory in their midst. So we have the Trutha Maimang, we have the Clan Crifts and the Clan Cumann, and we have the Kennel Corporate Crum. And these are the individual branches of early medieval Uí Maine. The Tír Sidon would then emerge with the O'Manions as the principal leaders of that clan, in essence, of that territory. The Õ Cellaigh emerged as a dominant sept of the Uí Maine in around about the 10th century, and themselves are originating out of the Kennel Corporate Crum branch of the dynasty. So this area, broadly South Roscommon from the end of the River Suck up to the River Hine, just south of Roscommon town. The most notable king of the Uí Maine during this period was Taigmor Õ Cellaigh, who died in the field at Clontarf in 1014 and was a very important ally to Brian Boru throughout his career. And it was a very interesting thing to note that there's ever so slight a change in political alliances that sees Taigmor very much coming along the side of the Dál Cais, which is something that wasn't seen previous to that. So in essence, that's where we see the Õ Cellaigh at around about the 11th and 12th century. However, there's considerable pressure being placed upon them, particularly by their dominant northern neighbours and the form of the O'Connors of Mochra Connacht, the Kings of Connacht, styled as the Kings of Connacht. So Mochra Connacht is the plains of Connacht. I actually operate in my professional capacity out of Rathcroghan Cruachan in the early medieval texts and the mythological and archaeological landscape of Cruachan. So that's the patronymy of the O'Connors. But by the 12th century, and certainly by the time we see Turlough O'Connor rising to power and his very long 50-year career at the first half of the 12th century, we see O'Connor interests expanding over effectively the entirety of the province of Connacht. One indication of this is seen with the number of what are described in the historical sources as castle being constructed at various locations throughout Connacht, from Athlone and Ballinasloe in the east through to what is now Galway City and as far as basically Clew Bay. And these are a part of an overall, I suppose, seizure of power by Turlough O'Connor, and of course, is going to have an impact on the O'Celleighs. The local level, we see Turlough and his predecessors and descendants also engaging in a series of different, I suppose, strategies. And one such strategy is the placement of canals, so the removal of some of their related kin groups out of their traditional areas in Connacht and the placement over subject populations. So one instance in what is the O'Celleigh patronymial lands of Tirvina, where we see actually the installation of the Clan Uda in the 12th century, the Clan Uda from whom emerged the O'Fallons, the O'Fallawan, and very much into the heartland of O'Celleigh country. So this encroachment obviously led then to reaction, and there was a lot of tit-for-tat fighting in the 12th century, but it eventually led to the O'Celleigh elite removing themselves from their original patrimony and migrating towards a different kingdom, a different territory, in order to retain some control. The very much the better quality land, if you're going to look at it from that perspective, would be the Southwest Common area, but as you cross the Suck into East Galway, it becomes a bit more marginal. So they're migrating into an area that was previously a semi-independent kingdom, and they turn it into Uí Maine, in broad terms at least. So their principal locations within Uí Maine at the end of the 12th century, early 13th century, would be the likes of Aughrim in East Galway, Ballinasloe and Kilconnell. However, they weren't allowed to stay there for very long, because by the early to mid 13th century, we see the encroachment of Anglo-Norman interests in Connacht more generally, and also in Tirvina and Uí Maine. So the map that I'm showing here are the land grants attached to various Anglo-Norman barons in the middle of the 13th century. And you can see, of course, Aughrim is actually a rural manor provided to Richard de la Rochelle in the 13th century, effectively evicting the O'Celleigh elite in the process. So again, the O'Celleigh are on the move. So for the next 50 years, you're talking about them eventually emerging back in Tirvina, their ancestral lands, under the authority of the O'Celleigh, or of the O'Connor and of the Anglo-Normans. This is the environment that Uilliam Buide enters into in about 1340. Okay, so a career in dates, if we use purely the historical and literary sources, we see Uilliam Buide arriving on the scene initially in 1340 as he kills Taigh Og O'Celleigh, who was the Lord of Uine. Taigh Og only reigned for 3 days. So you can see the immediacy with which the rival carry on is going on. Uilliam Buide would have been a legitimate rival for the kingship, and Taigh Og attempted to remove that rival, and it backfired effectively. But Uilliam Buide doesn't immediately ascend to the kingship. He doesn't seem to return to the kingship until about 1349, and at a very early point in his career, a praise poem, Chahin per Uí Maine, encounters at least 8 successful cattle raids, most likely all actual occurrences, as well as a construction of a new courch, or residence feasting hall, on an island site within his territory. 1351 sees him host a famous Christmas feast, which you may well be familiar with, which is immortalised in Fillier and Gahain Jock. And this is held at his Cahir, the stone fort site, as opposed to a castle, and Gailey in County Roscommon. He then founds in 1353 the Franciscan foundation of Kilconnell, as well as the Bodún, or the cattle fort, at Callow, very close by, about 3 kilometres to the north. 56, he attempts to, I suppose, wrest control of importance, at least, away from the O'Connor by killing one of their kings at Balladacre Loch, which again, from an archaeological perspective, does hold up evidence for later medieval elite settlement. In 1368, he retires in favour of his son Milshocklin, which again is not altogether in keeping with the traditional, I suppose, succession practices of the Gaelic elite throughout the period. It's a primogeniture that he's employing, which is quite innovative. 1372, he still is involved in an active capacity to a degree, where he defeats the Anglo-Norman de Birminghams, or Clan MacFirish, in the area around Athenry, which is again showing a demonstration of the expansionist and ambitious approaches that the O'Celleigh are taking at this point in time, which leads them effectively taking over territory that includes as far west as Abbeynock Moy. And in 1381, we see Uilliam Buide dying, a reign of 32 years, which is not normal for a very turbulent later medieval period for a Gaelic lord. He's eulogised as a great patron of the learned classes, and he hands over his rule to his son. And together they're over 52 years in reign, which is quite an achievement in its own right. So very briefly, I'm going to go through 3 case study areas of basically residential areas where the Õ Cellaigh elite, in particular Uilliam Buide, seem to be turning up. There are attributes that are shared across the 3 case studies and others besides, which are too far for us to explain today. But in the case of all, in effect, we have a concentration of elite activity around lakeland or riverine settings. We have communication routes, both overland and water-based, that are important to the placement of these elite centres. We've connected, patronised religious houses. We have service kindred land holdings, which are very important because of their location in association with the elite residents. And we also have the archaeological investigations, which tell us in each case that up until about the 15th century, the Gaelic lords in what is Õ Cellaigh country are residing in traditional settlement forms. They're not building tower houses at this point in time. And that is a misnomer when we break between the historical and the archaeological disciplines. And it's something that has to be understood. So in the case of Lough Crone is south of Roscommon town, about 15 kilometres, and is now a turlough. It's a dried out lake, a disappeared lake. However, the settlement archaeology within is indicating a very settled elite environment for the Uí Maine from at least as early as the 8th century. And when the Õ Ceallaighs come to prominence, they only copper fasten that point of continuity, even up to the point where we have a 16th century tower house constructed at Turlough. One such site was a site of excavation for investigation for my purposes, was basically a blip on the Turlough, which actually turns out not to be natural, but evidence for a substantial crannog site or an artificial island site with a cashel, a stone fort, dry stone wall fort in its interior. All that's left of the stone fort is just the skeleton, the foundation stones, and the settlement activity uncovered through geophysical investigations in its interior. The artifactual assemblage that we find from illegal metal detecting activity at Lough Crone in the 1990s uncovered some very interesting features, not least this beautiful little Camplave enamel mount, which would have come from the same workshop as far as Griffin Murray is concerned as the Cross of Con, which is obviously over the road here in Kildare Street. So this is part of the level of wealth and authority and prowess that's undertaken in these environments. So as an impression of what these lakeland dwellings may have looked like, this is a recently commissioned reconstruction illustration of the Rock of Lough Key, which would have been the principal caput of the MacDiarmada of Moyle Lurg. And the Rock of Lough Key in the 13th century has this cashel-like stone wall around its extremities, a feasting hall at an interior, and very much not in keeping with what we might perceive at a first instance of Gaelic lordship. So this is what I would perceive in certain respects as what would have appeared at Lough Crone as well. The second site is the Gailey Bay site that we referred to in Fillyhare and Gahainchock, and the same is true. At Lough Crone, we had a service kindred, the O'Dovagons, Sean Moore O'Dovagon, a principal poet historian attached to the Õ Ceallaighs. His family landholding is about 3 kilometres to the northwest of Lough Crone. Again, Sean Moore O'Dovagon and his family occur at the Crutch Friars at Rindoon in the late 14th century. Landholding attached to the elite are evidenced through later records, but even down to the archaeological focal point in and of itself at Gailey. We have the remnants of a tower house, which is again later, it's 16th century in date, but detailed investigations of the natural promontory upon which Gailey Castle is placed actually indicate that there was a double set of wet ditches, which are now very much silted up, and one is actually used by the Crofton family as a boathouse in the 19th and 20th century. There's a ramped causeway up to the summit, and there are remnants for, again, another Cahir or Cashel stronghold on its summit. And a reconstruction drawing commissioned as part of my PhD work indicates what Uilliam Buide's feast may have looked like in the mid-14th century. Not a castle, a Cahir or Cashel, okay? Just an impression of that again. And then thirdly, and most interestingly for our purposes, is the information we have from the references in the 1353 annalistic records for Callow, the Bawn or Bodoon of Callow being founded, and with it, the Kilconnell Franciscan Friary. The map that we see here very vividly indicates that there are actually a ring of service kindred, hereditary service kindred landholdings placed around the elite residence, as well as our religious house, its location along a very major overland routeway, the Slieve Moor, or the Esker Riada, basically the main Galway-Dublin road, which I drove today, as well as another number of other attributes that are consistent with elite Gaelic activity. So the Servant kindred land holdings in and of themselves, we see at Ballyduggan and Cartonduggan, we see the O'Donegan poet historians yet again. We see at Ballynabanaba, we see the O'Lonergans and the O'Sheadon musicians in this area here. At Éna or Antenach, we have the Mock Awards, poet historians yet again, or poets. And lastly, a suggestion on my part is that at Le Carroll McTully, we have the Macmail Tully or the Tully physicians, all in direct attachment to the elite settlement site. So these types of things, when we look at the multidisciplinary approach, we can gather this information all in together and make some very, very decent insights into what was going on. Again, if we look at the settlement archaeology for the period, or even the place names attached to them, we've got Lisnagree, which is the fort of the cattle tribute. We have Lisnacorty, which is the fort of the court or the invitation. We have the site of Callow Castle, another 16th century tower house on the site of continuity of a previous settlement. And then we have our Cranach on a lakeland setting yet again. The archaeological field work indicates that there was actually very fine jetty features off the eastern side of the Cranach, a rectangular dry stone walled house hut site in the interior, which may be later, but still in all, its use through time is indicative, and it's actually retained by a substantial revetment of stone on its extremities as well. In keeping with the Cranach, there's a dry land service site, and that's consistent with what I believe to be the Bodún of Callow, this very large enclosed space, which actually diverts the waters of the lake in order to form a defensive measure. And the castle, the later castle, is placed in alongside that. So before and after Uilliam Buide, in the period prior to the career of Uilliam Buide Õ Cellaigh, O'Kelly country effectively is Tír Vaina with some incursions into Uí Maine. The black dots that we see here are historical references relating to individual O'Kellys in various different locations throughout the lordship. After Uilliam Buide's career, we see an entirely expanded lordship. The lordship extends as far as Abbey-Knockmoy, which is very heavily patronised by the O'Kellys, to Quinn, which is where Mael Shocklan O'Kelly dies and had his residence as well, Uilliam Buide's son, amongst the other ones that we've talked about and others besides, at League being of interest from the previous talk. So the conclusions. There are a number of things that be concluded from Uilliam Buide's career. The later medieval Gaelic elite sought to gain and retain power in their world in a variety of means. These include, but are not limited to, reputational building exercises, such as commissioning of the Nosa Evaina, the feast, and the poem that describes the feast at Gailey Bay. We have our patronage of religious orders and foundations, such as the Kilconnell Friary at St. John's of Rindoon, at Cam, Abbey-Knockmoy, and Clontuskert O'Many. We've got patronage of hereditary learned families, from the O'Dovagons to the Mock Awards and on. We have creation or reuse of seemingly archaic or antique settlement forms. And there's an important note to make there. These antique settlement forms are not because of a lack of resources or wealth. It's actually because of an attempt or an interest in retaining a legacy and a pedigree in the past. And these are the attitudes that we need to take, because particularly when you're throwing up Franciscan friaries, you certainly have the wealth to be able to build a large castle if you so wish. However, the mindset of the Gaelic elite is not of that type. Engaging in traditional societal practices like what we've referred to, feasting, a peripatetic lifestyle, which means that you've got a lord moving throughout his lordship throughout the year. You've got cricca or raids as a demonstration of your wealth and prowess, and einigi or seasonal assemblies. The acquisition, retention, utilisation of cattle as an important source of wealth and economic activity, something that we see in the poetic sources, the historical record, and place name survivals. These approaches to kingship in later medieval Ireland do not always loom as large as the traditional historical or archaeological records, and as a result can be overlooked or misinterpreted. But multidisciplinary approaches with archaeological inquiry at its core can yield results in reconstructing these less visible past environments and societies. If there's questions now or wherever, if it's possible, I could do it. Yeah, whatever, I don't mind. Thanks very much.